Okay, we left off with the soapberry bugs, and what we're doing now in terms of the rest of this teaching units is talking about more modern ideas that have supported what Darwin, are modern discoveries or modern observations that support what Darwin wrote in his art on the origin of species. And so this soapberry bug, what has been found is that you have the same bug, and those that live in an area where this balloon vine has been introduced to their environment have evolved a longer beak. This longer beak because the fruit of the soapberry bug of the balloon vine is larger. The beak's a little bit longer so that that soapberry bug can actually insert the beak and then get the nutrients out. This is an introduced plant, and this is an evolution that's happening with regard to an introduced plant, as opposed to the species. Well, actually, I think I have it backward. The native species ate on the balloon vine with the smaller beak, and then the larger fruit is on the golden rain tree that was introduced, or smaller fruit, so they have a shorter beak. So what you have is this observation of evolution and happening actually in our own time, not so much the soap bug's own time, because again, it's populations that evolve, but you have several populations that have existed in 35 years of our time. But we actually see this in species that we have introduced to their environment, if you can think of it that way. And actually, just not that it came from your textbook, but they have found bacteria that actually can feed on plastics. It's not, it's not that hopeful that we're going to be able to get rid of plastics, but certainly plastics didn't exist before the 50s, and so these are bacteria that actually evolved to feed on plastic. So that's the soapberry bug idea, and then also you have graphically, in terms of graphs, their beak length. And their beak length over time due to the introduction of this non-native species, but the bugs have adapted to eat it. Another theory that has supported Darwin is this idea of homologs. And so the homologs are common structures anatomically that have resemblance to one another, and also can be traced back to a common ancestor. So in a human, you have your arm bone with your upper arm bone, the humerus, the radius, the carpals, the metacarpals, and phalanges. You have the same arrangement in a cat, so a similar arrangement, that's the homolog. You have a similar arrangement in a whale and a similar arrangement in a bat with regard to, and comparing the bat to the human, you have a humerus and a humerus bone, that's the purple one. You have the ulna or radius, whichever it happens to be, as the kind of the orangey one, and then you'd have these in the bat, in the wing you actually have what becomes the carpals, metacarpals, and then phalanges in terms of bones. Not used the same way, I'm not saying that, but certainly the same anatomical, a similar anatomical design, where one can see how there might have been an evolution of that design. Now, I'm not saying that we evolved from bats, but an evolution of that design in similar species. And then another general area that supports Darwin's theory is this comparative embryology, because we do find in the embryo between the chick and the human, or between the human and even other species, that there are areas that are very similar when the cells, so the embryologic cells are not as highly differentiated as what would happen as this embryo progresses. You do have these pharyngeal arches. These pharyngeal arches, they think, are what then eventually became gills becoming lungs. And then you also have this post-anal tail, which exists in the chicken, and then you can also see a little piece of it there in the embryo. Generally, humans don't have tails. I'm not trying to tell you that. Every once in a while, it's very rare, a child will be born with a little bit of residual tail, and of course it'll be surgically removed right away. But this would be the anatomical similarities between species. There's also vestigial structures that are supportive of Darwin's theories, and these then can be traced down the family tree, so they can be traced, and what you have, we're starting, and these vestigial structures, which I guess we should define it, are remnants of features that served important functions in the ancestors and no longer perform that function. One of the very common vestigial structures that of course is still talked about is the appendix in the human. The appendix is very important in those highly plant-eating species, and they contain a bacteria that actually helps those species dissolve those plants. We don't use our appendix anymore. It's a vestigial structure. It's not to the present time known what the purpose of it is, but the idea is that it had a great purpose at one time. It's just that evolution has created the lack of need for it, to our knowledge anyway, at this point. And then what you also see is similar characteristics. So you have similar characteristics with regard to the digit-bearing limbs, and then similar characteristics in terms of young being supported in an amniotic sac, and then also feathers. So we're talking about structures that are similar in species, and since they're similar in species that we see, the thought is that they must have come from an ancient ancestor. There's also supportive data with regard to this in terms of the molecular level, where as I said before, there are certain molecular sequences that we have in our body, in our genome, that we share with even very ancient bacteria, etc. The idea of convergent evolution, what you have here is a sugar glider and a flying squirrel. Both evolved in very, very different places. North America and Australia. If you fly to Australia, this is how far it is. It's many hours. It's 14 hours, or it takes a long while to fly to Australia. Maybe that's with stopovers, but anyway, it's far away. A sugar glider can jump from tree to tree, but not that far. And what happens with this convergent evolution, they're distinctly, there are similar features, but they evolved in different geographical areas. And what the sugar glider can do, its ability to jump from tree to tree, so that characteristic and the anatomical portion of the structure of each of these squirrels that give them the ability to jump from tree to tree has evolved in convergent ways. There's also this idea of fossil records that supports Darwin's theory, and with this, what you have is at the top you have the end of the foot. so I don't want to call it the foot bone, but the end of the foot bone of a dog, which is a meat eater, compared to these even-toed ungulates like a pig and a deer that are herbivores or not meat eaters. But you see very similarities between an animal that's very much of a meat eater and an animal that's not a meat eater. And then in the middle with this this fossil in the middle, Pakitheus is extinct, but it can be the bridge between the two very distinct species, a meat eater and a non-meat eater, till you get to a pig and a deer. And then you can see this this fossils is providing the evidence between a deer and a hippopotamus. The closest ancestor we have to living say whales and porpoises, etc., is a hippopotamus. And you can trace that back to a common ancestor if in fact you are looking at the fossil records of the animals that are in between. And then the last couple of topics, you have this biogeography, that at one time the Earth's continents were all one big continent called Pangaea. They became separated by continental drift, and this separation by continental drift accounts for the fact that different species have a related ancestor. So you can see where the emu and the ostrich and the kiwi and the birds from Papua New Guinea and South America have very common characteristics, but also evolved again to adapt to their very varying different environments. And so this would be biogeography in terms of how that supports the idea of evolution. And then the last little thing to talk about is this idea of endemic species. These are species that aren't found anywhere else in the world. Generally, in isolated areas like islands have endemic species. They are related to those species on the mainland, but they have their own evolutionary path as they've come away from the mainland. And then Darwin, because again it was the Galapagos he went to, he explained that species on islands give rise to new species because they adapt to that island environment. So the idea is that they take they ride in the waters on, say, something that's floating in the waters like a shipwreck or something. They call it flotsam and jetsam. But think of like a big board that's part of a ship that broke apart, and that iguana, the swimming iguana, managed to float across to the Galapagos Islands, made it there and made a life for themselves there, and over time the populations have adapted to live there, so that eventually between the Galapagos Islands and then Latin or South America, you have a common ancestor in the species, but the Galapagos Island species are very unique in terms of the fact that they have evolved on that island. And then with regard to science even now, that there are theories that account for many of the observations and data that Darwin started out. We have added to it and try to integrate the phenomena we see. And his information does a good job of integrating the diverse areas of biological study. But there are still many questions to be answered, and they are being researched as we speak. Here's the list of the things that you should know. Do try to separate the different people that we talked about and what their general contribution to Darwin's thought process was. Darwin's descent with modification, and then those the 4 lines of evidence following for evolution by natural selection, like homology, like the antibiotic antibiotic, ento the resistant bacteria. And I will see you on the next teaching time.